Breaking news is exploding across Britain right now. Keir Starmer is on the verge of resigning after shocking new revelations were leaked live on television just minutes ago. Revelations so devastating and so damaging that even his most loyal defenders are abandoning him and demanding that he step down immediately before causing any more damage to what's left of his reputation and his party. The leak happened during a live political news programme when a guest who was supposed to be discussing routine policy matters suddenly produced documents that nobody knew existed, documents that prove Starmer's corruption goes even deeper than anyone previously understood and that show he has been lying about virtually everything throughout his entire political career. The documents include additional offshore account records showing millions more in hidden assets that weren't previously known. Communications proving he was directly involved in corrupt contract awards that he had claimed to know nothing about, and most explosively, evidence that he has been under active criminal investigation for months. While publicly denying that any such investigations existed, the host of the programme was visibly shocked as the documents were presented and began to realise that this wasn't planned segment but was deliberate leak of information that someone had been holding and had chosen this moment to release for maximum impact. The guests producing the documents explained that they had received them from multiple whistleblowers within law enforcement and within financial institutions who were disgusted that Starmer had been able to delay and obstruct investigations for so long and who wanted the British public to know the full truth about the extent of his corruption before he could flee the country or destroy additional evidence. The timing of the leak appears calculated to coincide with reports that Starmer has been making preparations to leave Britain, liquidating assets, and making arrangements that suggest he knows criminal charges are imminent and that he's planning to relocate to jurisdiction without extradition treaty where he could avoid prosecution. The leak was designed to expose these plans and to create public pressure that would make it impossible for Starmer to escape accountability by fleeing abroad. The live television leak began innocuously enough, with the programme host introducing a segment about Labour's electoral challenges and bringing on a political analyst to discuss the party's strategy going forward. But within seconds of the segment beginning, it became clear that something unexpected was happening. The analyst, rather than discussing electoral strategy, immediately stated that they needed to address new information that had just come to their attention about Keir Starmer's ongoing criminal exposure. The host tried to redirect the conversation back to electoral topics, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading, but the analyst persisted, saying that what they were about to reveal was too important to ignore and that the British public had a right to know immediately. The analyst then produced a folder of documents and began methodically explaining what they showed. The first set of documents were bank records from previously unknown offshore accounts that had been established more recently than the ones that had already been exposed and that contained substantial additional sums of money. The analyst explained that these accounts had been discovered through forensic investigation of Starmer's financial network and that they showed he had continued to hide money even after the earlier offshore accounts had been exposed, suggesting that what had been revealed previously was just a fraction of his total hidden wealth. The amounts involved were staggering, with these new accounts containing over £5 million that had never been declared to tax authorities and that appeared to have come from sources that Starmer had never disclosed. The second set of documents that the analyst presented were email communications between Starmer and various government contractors, communications that directly contradicted his previous claims about not being involved in contract award decisions. The emails showed Starmer personally instructing officials to award specific contracts to specific firms, discussing with contractors how to structure bids to ensure they would win, and in some cases explicitly referencing payments he had received or expected to receive from these contractors. One particularly damning email chain showed Starmer telling an official to ensure that a particular firm won a contract despite that firm not being the lowest bidder or the most qualified, with the email making clear that the decision was being made because of the contractor's political support and financial contributions rather than on merit. Another email showed Starmer discussing with an advisor how to hide the connections between payments he received and contracts awarded, with the advisor suggesting using intermediary organisations to make the money flows even less obvious. These communications destroyed any remaining possibility of Starmer claiming he hadn't been directly involved in corrupt contracting or that the connections between payments and contracts were coincidental. His own emails proved he had been actively managing corrupt relationships and had been conscious that what he was doing was wrong and needed to be hidden. The analyst presenting these documents noted that they had been provided by whistleblowers who had preserved copies before being ordered to delete them, and that these whistleblowers were cooperating with criminal investigations that were ongoing despite Starmer's public denials. The third and most explosive set of documents related to the criminal investigations themselves. The analyst revealed that Starmer has been designated as a target of multiple criminal investigations by the Serious Fraud Office and by other law enforcement agencies, designations that had been kept confidential but that the whistleblowers had disclosed because they believed Starmer was being given preferential treatment and was being allowed to obstruct investigations in ways that ordinary suspects would never be permitted to do. The documents showed that investigators had sought warrants to search Starmer's properties and to seize his financial records, but that these warrants had been delayed or denied by officials who appeared to be protecting him. There were communications between investigators and their superiors where the investigators expressed frustration that their investigation was being hindered and that they were being pressured to slow down or to avoid certain lines of inquiry that might prove embarrassing to powerful people connected to Starmer. Most alarmingly, the documents included intelligence reports suggesting that Starmer was making preparations to flee Britain, including selling properties, transferring money to foreign accounts, and making contact with lawyers in countries that don't extradite to the UK. The analyst presenting this information called it unprecedented that someone under active criminal investigation for such serious crimes was being allowed to liquidate assets and make preparations to flee rather than being arrested or having his passport confiscated to prevent flight risk. The host of the programme, having initially tried to redirect the conversation, eventually gave up and allowed the analyst to continue presenting the documents, recognising that this was genuine news event and that trying to suppress it on air would create even more controversy than letting it proceed. The programme became impromptu documentary on Starmer's corruption, with the analyst walking through document after document showing the systematic nature of his criminal conduct and the ways in which he had been protected by officials who should have been investigating and prosecuting him. Viewers watching live were stunned by what they were seeing, and social media exploded with reactions as clips from the broadcast began circulating immediately. Within minutes of the revelations being broadcast, calls began flooding in to law enforcement demanding to know why Starmer hadn't been arrested, why he was being allowed to prepare to flee the country, and why investigations had apparently been obstructed by officials who should have been facilitating them. The political pressure on law enforcement and on prosecutors became overwhelming almost instantly, making it impossible for them to continue delaying action or to continue providing Starmer with the preferential treatment that the leaked documents showed he had been receiving. The immediate fallout from the live television leak was chaotic and multifaceted. Law enforcement agencies issued statements saying they couldn't comment on ongoing investigations, but that they took allegations of obstruction seriously and would be reviewing the leaked documents to determine what actions were appropriate. This careful non-denial essentially confirmed that the investigations described in the leaked documents were real and that Starmer was indeed a target, lending credibility to everything the analyst had revealed during the broadcast. Political opponents immediately called for Starmer's immediate arrest, arguing that someone who was preparing to flee the country to avoid prosecution should be treated like any other flight risk and should be detained pending trial. They pointed to the double standard where ordinary citizens facing far less serious charges would be held in custody if there were any indication they might flee, while Starmer was apparently being allowed to sell assets and make arrangements to leave Britain despite being investigated for corruption involving millions of pounds. Legal experts noted that the leaked intelligence about flight preparations would normally be more than sufficient grounds for arrest or at minimum for passport confiscation to prevent absconding, and that the failure to take such basic precautions suggested either incompetence or deliberate protection of Starmer by officials who should have been treating him like any other suspect. Within hours of the broadcast, reports emerged that Starmer's lawyers had contacted police to deny that he was planning to flee and to explain that asset sales were routine financial management rather than preparation for absconding. But these denials rang hollow given the specificity of the intelligence that had been leaked, intelligence that included details about specific properties being sold, specific foreign accounts receiving transfers, and specific contacts with lawyers in non-extradition countries. The pattern described in the leaked documents was too detailed and too consistent with flight preparation to be explained away as coincidental financial planning. Public pressure on law enforcement intensified dramatically, with demonstrations outside police headquarters demanding that Starmer be arrested and demanding explanations for why investigations had apparently been obstructed. The protesters carried signs referencing the leaked documents and demanding equal justice under law, arguing that the principle that no one is above the law was being violated by the apparent preferential treatment Starmer was receiving. Media coverage was extensive and almost uniformly critical of law enforcement's handling of the investigations, with journalists asking pointed questions about who had ordered the obstruction described in the leaked documents and what consequences those officials would face for interfering with legitimate criminal investigations. The political implications of the leaked revelations were equally explosive. The 100 Labour MPs who had already signed the coup letter demanding Starmer's resignation were vindicated, with their concerns about his continuing to damage the party being proven correct by these additional exposures of corruption and potential flight from justice. Additional Labour MPs announced they were joining the calls for immediate resignation, with some going further to demand that Starmer be expelled from the party entirely and that Labour cooperate fully with any criminal investigations rather than protecting him. The party's leadership, such as it was given the ongoing chaos, issued statements saying they took the allegations seriously and calling on Starmer to respond to the specific claims made in the leaked documents. But the weakness of this response, failing to demand immediate resignation or to cut ties definitively with someone who had been exposed as planning to flee criminal prosecution, damaged Labour further and reinforced perceptions that the party was more concerned with managing optics than with standing on principle against corruption. Reform Party and other opposition parties used the leaked revelations to attack Labour's moral authority and to argue that the entire party had been complicit in protecting Starmer and enabling his corruption, making them collectively responsible for the damage he had caused. The question of who had leaked the documents and why they had chosen to do so via live television rather than through normal law enforcement channels became subject of intense speculation and investigation. The analyst who had presented the documents on air refused to identify sources beyond saying they were whistleblowers within law enforcement and financial institutions who were acting out of conscience and frustration with obstruction of investigations. The timing suggested careful planning, with the leak occurring at a moment when it would have maximum impact and would make it difficult for Starmer to flee before being arrested. Some speculated that the whistleblowers had become aware that Starmer's flight preparations were advancing and had decided that public exposure was the only way to ensure he faced accountability rather than escaping to jurisdiction where he couldn't be prosecuted. Others suggested that investigators whose work had been obstructed had deliberately leaked the information to create political pressure that would force their superiors to allow investigations to proceed unhindered. Regardless of the specific motivations, the effect was to make Starmer's position completely untenable and to create overwhelming pressure for immediate action, including arrest, asset freezing, and passport confiscation to prevent flight. The cascade of consequences following the live television leak accelerated rapidly. Within 24 hours, police executed search warrants at several properties associated with Starmer, seizing computers, documents and financial records that would be used as evidence in the criminal cases being built against him. This action, coming so quickly after the public leak strongly suggested that investigators had already prepared the warrants and had been waiting either for permission from superiors or for public pressure sufficient to overcome political objections to searching a former Prime Minister's properties. The searches were carried out publicly with media present, creating dramatic images of police removing boxes of evidence from homes and offices where Starmer had conducted business. The symbolic power of seeing a former Prime Minister's properties being searched by police was enormous and drove home the reality that he was facing serious criminal jeopardy. Simultaneously, authorities moved to free Starmer's assets to prevent further liquidation and to preserve potential proceeds of crime for eventual forfeiture if he was convicted. The asset freeze came too late to prevent some of the transfers described in the leaked documents, but did stop additional movement of money and sent clear message that authorities were treating Starmer as serious flight risk who needed to be constrained. Most significantly, police moved to confiscate Starmer's passport and issued notice that he was not to leave the country pending completion of investigations and any resulting criminal proceedings. This action, which should have been taken much earlier given the evidence of flight preparations, was forced by the public pressure following the leak and represented acknowledgement that preferential treatment could no longer be justified or sustained. The passport confiscation effectively ended any remaining possibility that Starmer could flee to avoid prosecution, ensuring that he would have to face whatever charges were eventually brought against him. The speed with which these actions were taken after the leak, in stark contrast to the apparent delays and obstructions before the leak, validated the whistleblower's decision to go public and showed that public pressure and transparency could force accountability even when normal institutional processes were failing or being deliberately undermined. Legal experts noted that the sequence of events suggested that prosecutors had been preparing cases but had been prevented from moving forward until public outrage made inaction impossible, revealing disturbing questions about political interference in prosecutorial decisions that would need to be addressed through reforms to ensure independent law enforcement. The revelations about obstruction of investigations triggered separate inquiries into who had interfered with legitimate law enforcement activities and why. The leaked documents had named specific officials who had delayed warrants, who had pressured investigators to slow down, and who had provided Starmer with information about investigation strategies that should have been kept confidential. These officials now face their own investigations about potential obstruction of justice, perversion of the course of justice and misconduct in public office. Several were suspended from their positions pending investigation, and there were calls for criminal prosecution of anyone who had deliberately interfered with investigations to protect Starmer. The institutional damage from these revelations was severe, raising questions about the independence of law enforcement from political influence and about the existence of two-tier justice system where powerful people received protection that ordinary citizens never would. The reforms that would be needed to address these systemic problems would be extensive and would require cultural change within law enforcement agencies, as well as structural reforms to insulate investigations from political pressure. The fact that it had taken whistleblowers risking their careers to expose this corruption and obstruction was indictment of official oversight mechanisms that had failed to prevent or correct the abuses.